Now, Brexit is back centre stage today, with the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, due to give a speech this afternoon setting out the government's vision for the transition period, the 2 or so years after we leave the EU in March next year. But when it comes to life after Brexit, there have been plenty of noises off to show that not everyone in the Conservative Party is happy. When Chancellor Philip Hammond took to the stage in front of business leaders at Davos yesterday, he said that Britain's trade relationship with the EU will only change, hopefully very modestly, after Brexit. Well, that met with a frosty response from Downing Street, with a government spokesperson saying any new partnership could not be described as very modest changes. And it definitely prompted boos from many pro-Brexit Conservatives back in the UK. Jacob Rees-Mogg said the government's timid and cowering approach risked squandering the potential gains of leaving the EU, and added that close alignment after Brexit is unacceptable. The former minister, Andrew Percy, put it more bluntly and said the Chancellor should put a sock in it. Brexit Secretary David Davis is expected to tell his audience this afternoon that the UK wants to replicate the effects of the customs union during the transition period, but should be able to negotiate trade deals, which would come into force at the end of the period. Well, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has been speaking to journalists in Davos this morning, and Kamal Ahmed asked the Chancellor if he was a hyper-soft Brexiteer.
No, not at all. I said yesterday that we will leave the European Union in 2019, and at the same time we will leave the customs union and we'll leave the single market. What I was explaining to my audience is that starting as we do with a very high degree of trade with the EU, a very high level of alignment, we should be able to negotiate a very high degree of market access for the future and a very smooth process at the border, which means that there should be minimal disruption to the trade patterns that the companies I was speaking to already have with the European Union. That will protect British prosperity and protect British jobs.
Well, that was Philip Hammond. We're joined now by the Conservative MP and leading Eurosceptic Bernard Jenkins. Welcome to the Daily Politics. I mean, Philip Hammond used a speech in Davos yesterday where he said the UK economy he only wanted it to move very modestly apart from the EU after Brexit. What was wrong with that?
Well, the Prime Minister obviously didn't like that phrasing. I think that the speech as a whole reinforced the impression that the Chancellor is trying to pursue a different policy from the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has been very clear in her speeches, in the Lancaster House speech, in the Conservative manifesto no less, that we're leaving the customs union. We're going to seek to do a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU. We're going to do similar agreements with other countries. This isn't some modest change, it's a very substantial change, and you can't be half in and half out of a customs union.
Right, but doesn't the Chancellor, and shouldn't he be able to speak for the government on this issue?
Well, I think he should. I speak with some sympathy for the Chancellor. These are very febrile times. Everyone's watching very closely and picking things up. But I think to put into a speech how he agrees and supports the views of Carolyn Fairbairn just after the CBI has campaigned very vociferously for it to stay in the customs union permanently, I mean, was in danger of giving the wrong impression, wasn't it? And I think maybe with practice he'll stop doing it. Right.
Well, what should happen, do you think? Should he be sanctioned? Would you like to see a different Chancellor?
I think the Prime Minister is a little bit hobbled by the fact that the Cabinet doesn't reflect the same views as the vast majority of the parliamentary party. And it's that arithmetic which also reflects the views of the country. Bear in mind, even David Cameron could only persuade about half the MPs to vote for Remain. Well, most of the MPs are for Leave, Conservative MPs. The Ulster Unionists are for Leave. Every major party in the election stood on a Leave ticket. The British people voted Leave. House of Commons and House of Lords have all voted Leave.
Right.
So,
But Philip Hammond is saying that Britain is leaving the customs union and the single market.
I don't think smuggling the United Kingdom back into a very similar arrangement that we're just leaving constitutes leaving in most people's minds. The Prime Minister answered a question in the House of Commons just before Christmas to Sir Edward Lee. She made it absolutely clear we are going to have full regulatory autonomy. Now, if you're in a customs union, you don't have full regulatory autonomy. You can't have full regulatory autonomy.
Right.
But
Philip Hammond wants
to do trade deals with other countries, you need full regulatory autonomy.
So what do you say to Philip Hammond when he says he wants close alignment even after we've left the EU with the institutions?
Well, so long as we are in control of what is aligned and what is not aligned, and we're not bound by some permanent UK-EU agreement, like Norway is, for example, or like Switzerland, we want Canada plus, not not some Norway version, which is really a halfway house. I mean, people like Ukraine and Turkey have done customs union agreements with the EU in order to try and get into the EU. We're leaving the EU.
Right.
We don't want to be in the customs union.
You say that the Prime Minister is hobbled by Philip Hammond. What should she do about him?
Well, I think she needs to have a frank conversation with him. I think they need to talk frankly about what advice the government is getting from officials, because, I mean, I saw a tweet from a former Foreign Office official. He ridiculed me for saying that, and saying, of course, 90% of Foreign Office officials are in favour of remaining in the EU. I think there is a tremendous inertia in the bureaucracy that is making very heavy weather of Brexit, and a lot of that is reflected in advice to ministers.
But maybe Philip Hammond genuinely and sincerely holds the beliefs that he does about the sort of Brexit that he wants.
Well, I think that if there are really big ideological divisions between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, that is usually not very good news for the stability of a government, and the Prime Minister will need to address that one way or the other, and I will leave that thought there with you.
Right. I mean, the only way to address it, of course, is to push him out of the cabinet.
Well, it has to be. If there are serious ideological differences between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, that is a very serious thing for the stability of any government.
Right. And Andrew Percy, one of your colleagues, said that Philip Hammond should put a sock in it. Is that what you would also like to see the Chancellor do?
I think the Chancellor should support the Prime Minister's policy and make clear that he is supporting the Prime Minister's policy, and not try and play blow football with the policy and to try and make it into something that it isn't. Right,
except we've just heard actually from the number 10 spokesperson that the Prime Minister has full confidence in the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. Do you?
Well, it's always a bit dangerous when the Prime Minister having to express confidence in her Prime Minister. It suggests...
In her Chancellor.
In the Chancellor. I seem to remember Margaret Thatcher doing the same thing with Nigel Lawson.
And how long did that last?
Not very long.
Has Theresa May got a grip on her cabinet? Bearing in mind Philip Hammond isn't the only person speaking out, perhaps beyond his brief. Boris Johnson did the same.
To some extent, cabinets are always a coalition, and they have to be. You have to balance the different views in the cabinet, and the Prime Minister is only primus inter pares. She only chairs the meetings. The cabinet ministers run their departments. I think what is the problem here is the Prime Minister has set out a very clear policy. The Cabinet doesn't really reflect the views of the parliamentary party that she has set out.
What is the clear policy? Because beyond the speeches where she said that the UK is leaving the single market and the customs union, which Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, says he agrees with, that is what's going to happen. What is the policy?
Well, I think there's some confusion crept in about whether there is some distinction between the customs union and a customs union.
Is that a red line for you about the UK joining a customs union?
Well, if we joined a customs union, that would be completely contrary to what the Prime Minister has been consistently saying from the beginning, and I don't expect her to change that policy.
Are you happy with the status quo position on the customs union and probably the single market for the period of the transition?
Yes, I think most Conservative MPs will tolerate that. It's very far from ideal, but there are some qualifications to put the United Kingdom in the position where we are basically subject to an alien legislative process. There would have to be safeguards, and there would also have to be safeguards to stop the European Court of Justice doing something unexpected that affects our national interests during that period.
Right.
And finally, it is going to be an implementation period. The Prime Minister has been very clear about that. It can't be an extension of the negotiations. It means that when we sign the deal and agree to the implementation period and to paying all that money, we are actually implementing a trade agreement which has broadly been agreed at the outset. We're not going to carry on negotiating a trade agreement and be held hostage by the European Union all over again after we've paid all that money. That would be ludicrous.
You think Philip Hammond should be brought into line. What about Jacob Rees-Mogg? Is it really right that he is able to question David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, in the way that he did, criticising government policy in the Brexit negotiations?
Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg is not a member of the government. He's not subject to collective
responsibility.
But
is it helpful in terms of the unity of the party?
I think Jacob Rees-Mogg is absolutely entitled to do what he is paid to do on that committee, which is scrutinise government policy. By all means, ask me about Boris Johnson. I don't think Boris Johnson should be briefing out what he says to the cabinet. It's 6 of one and half a dozen the other. I think most people have got a lot of sympathy for Theresa May. She is doing a very difficult job. She's got a lot of fractious members of her cabinet who are arguing with each other, and I think the parliamentary party as a whole would like her to see her to impose her authority. Let the leopard come bounding out of the cage and show her authority.
Well, on that poetic note, Bernard Jenkins, thank you very much.